Good morning and welcome to another online Sunday school class with Tunnel Hill Baptist Church. As always, we like to begin by reminding you that we here at Tunnel Hill Baptist Church believe that Jesus is the Christ, that He's the Son of the living God who lived a perfect life and died a sacrificial death for your sins and for mine, and that if you will place your hope and trust in Jesus Christ as both Lord and Savior, that you will be saved. If you'd like more information about what it means to make Jesus Christ your personal Lord and Savior, we would invite you to follow the link in our description. It will take you to a full gospel presentation. It'll also show you how to respond to the gospel and how to connect with Tunnel Hill Baptist Church. If you live in the Hardin County, Kentucky area, we would invite you to join us for worship right here at Tunnel Hill Baptist Church at 11 a.m. on Sunday mornings. We're also on Facebook Live. If you do not live in the Hardin County, Kentucky area, we still want to connect with you because we want to help you find a Bible-believing church where you do live. Excuse me. Our session today is session 4, which is titled Satisfies. And we're going to be looking at Mark chapter 6, verses 30 through 44. So again, this is session 4, titled Satisfies, looking at Mark chapter 6, verses 30 through 44. I want you to think about, just a second, commercials. Have you ever watched one of those commercials where someone has something and then they kind of get compared to something else and they decide that what they have isn't good and they want what the other person had? And just to give you an example of this, I seem to kind of remember being a young person, and there was a big competition in the 80s and into the 90s between the two main cola companies here in the United States, and you know which one those two are. And at that time, they would do these like taste tests where you could even go to the mall, or you could go to certain places and you could try both brands, and they would tell you which one you preferred. And during that time, they would do commercial after commercial where they showed one brand being the brand for the next generation, was kind of their logo or their tagline at that time. And so they often made it appear as though the one brand was for the old, boring, unexciting people, and the other brand was for the exciting people. And they would show people drinking one kind of soda and in a car in a convertible, having fun, going to the beach, doing all sorts of other things. And the person drinking the other brand was doing nothing and being unexciting. And it was trying to create this idea that if you enjoy this soda, you're missing out because there is more fun to be had. There is more to do if you enjoy the other soda. And so I want you to think about this, and I want you to think about that for just a little bit. How do marketers try to encourage the idea of dissatisfaction in our lives? So think about that for a second. Take a couple minutes. Maybe think about another way that a commercial or a magazine ad or I don't know, a Super Bowl ad or something like that kind of encourages you to not be happy with your own life and to want something else. And with that, what ways might a person be tempted to kind of be dissatisfied and not be happy with their own life just in our world today? What are those temptations? So we have ads, maybe what are those ads, and then what are other ways that we kind of have that? Take a couple minutes, discuss that, pausing the video. You can discuss it with people, you can write some things down on a pen and paper, and then we'll keep going in our study. So take a couple minutes, discuss that, and then we'll keep going. All right, so hopefully you've maybe thought of some other ads that kind of hint at that same thing. I think, mentioning the soda ad to begin with, I think that one of the big things that really gets us and really tempts us and leads us to be dissatisfied with our own life and certain things is what I call the comparison game. And in my profession as a pastor, and I think in a lot of other things, whether you're a parent or whatever you might do, it is always very, very, very tempting to want to compare ourselves to other people. How are they doing as it relates, compared to me? How do they look as it relates to me? How are their kids, or how is their job, or how is their house or their car, whatever it might be. And there's always this desire to compare. And I think that leads to a lot of dissatisfaction. But our story today and our passage today is going to talk about the opposite of that. It's going to talk about being satisfied and about what it means to be satisfied, and specifically satisfied in Christ. The book says it this way. It says, in today's session, we are going to look at how Jesus is the only one who can truly satisfy our needs. So let's dive into our text a little bit. We're going to be in Mark chapter 6. We're going to start in verse 30. Now, by this point in Mark chapter 6, Jesus has been all throughout Galilee. He has had a very kind of unwelcome reception from his home area. He has gone to where he used to be, and they have not been a particularly huge fan of him. I want to make sure that I'm correct there. He has gone off, and now he has sent the 12 off. And then in the midst of this, John the Baptist has died, and all sorts of stuff has kind of happened. And as we jump into our passage today, we find Jesus with his disciples after they have returned from going out and proclaiming the kingdom and doing ministry. And it's going to be interesting. I want you to look at this, and I want you to think about why the disciples needed rest. So let's look at this, verses 30 through 32. Picking up in verse 30, we see this. It says, the apostles gathered around Jesus and reported to him all they had done and taught. Jesus said to them, come away by yourselves to a remote place and rest for a while. For many were coming and going, and they did not even have time to eat. Excuse me. So they went away by boat by themselves to a remote place. But many saw them leaving and recognized them, and they ran on foot from all the towns and arrived ahead of them. So as we think about why the disciples needed rest, we recognize that they had gone out. They had gone to all of these places, and you can look earlier in the text and see kind of what the instructions were and what they had done. And they had been preaching. They had been healing. They had been doing all of these wonderful things. And now that they'd got back to Jesus, and they were telling him and kind of reporting all the good things that had happened. And Jesus says, hey, let's go rest. Let's go someplace. Let's pull away a little bit, give you guys an opportunity to rest. And notice in the passage that it says they didn't even have time to eat. So they had been doing all of this work and doing all this service, and they'd been making their way back, and they had got to a point where they were tired, they were hungry, and they were just exhausted. And that happens, and that happens to everybody at all times. It is very easy for us to kind of get caught up in the things that we're doing, whether it's ministry or even secular things, and find ourselves in a place where we are tired, we are hungry, thirsty, whatever that might be. The book asks this question. It says, how can we recognize when we are exhausted? What impact can that have on the way we minister to others? So let's actually take a couple minutes, pause the video, write some things down, discuss those things, and then we'll kind of get back and talk about it together. How can we recognize when we are exhausted, and what impact can that have on the way that we minister to others? Pause the video, discuss that, and then we'll keep going in our study. All right, so I want to think about this for just a second. And there's a lot of ways that we can be exhausted. We can be physically exhausted. We can be mentally exhausted. We can be emotionally exhausted, spiritually exhausted. These are all things, and they all happen kind of the same way. And we need to look and recognize the signs that we are those things. You know, when you're physically exhausted or mentally exhausted, what are the signs that exist? I'll tell you kind of a clue or an indicator to me when I'm starting to get just exhausted, when I'm starting to get mostly physically and mentally exhausted, emotionally too. One of the things that I notice is some of the little things in life start to kind of pile up. And so the biggest example for me is when I'm doing too much, when I'm getting physically and mentally exhausted, I'm going to see it in kind of the way my car looks. And I'm not talking about the outside, but rather the inside. When I start to notice that I have garbage, or I have items, I have kids' clothes because my children have been coming back and forth from things, or my clothes, or just papers and whatnot in my car, and they've got to really begin to kind of really fill up my car, and my car is cluttered, that's usually an indicator to me that I'm doing too much, and I've gotten to a place where I'm not getting those things even out of the car, because when I get home or when I get to work, I just have to rush in, either rush into work and I don't want to worry about those things, or when I get home in the evening, I don't want to mess with bringing in papers and sorting through them, so I just leave them there. Sometimes that may be your home, that may be your bathroom or your bedroom. These are often a sign of those things. When we talk about being maybe emotionally exhausted or even spiritually exhausted, is when we start grinding things out and we really don't care about who we're ministering to or what we're taking care of. We stop seeing people as people and start seeing them as like a customer that we just want to kind of move along and get to the next one. Those are really good signs that we are becoming physically, emotionally, mentally, or spiritually exhausted. And it probably is an indicator that we need to take a moment and we need to rest. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean quit. I actually have a quote from a friend of mine that came up in my feed from our partner church up in Indianapolis. That was a quote they had up that said, "If you're tired, rest, don't quit." And I really like that line, and I've actually been kind of thinking about that ever since I kind of got that reminder recently, is that a lot of people, when they get tired, when they're physically physically, emotionally, spiritually exhausted, that a lot of times what happens is we think we need to quit things. We need to quit. A lot of times what we actually need to do is not quit. We need to rest. We need to just say, hey, I'm going to set these things down. They're not going anywhere, and they're not nearly as urgent as sometimes I want to think they are, and I just need to rest. I need to rest in what's going on, and then when I'm rested, I can go back and tackle it. I can go back and address it and do a little bit better. And sometimes that means asking for help, asking other people to step in and do things. Sometimes that means just letting something not get done for a little bit. But rest is an important thing. In fact, I want to challenge you this week. This is something the book says, and I really like. I want to challenge you to set a goal of setting aside at least 5 minutes a day to rest over the next week. This means that for 5 minutes each day, you sit down and you rest. Now you can talk with God. You can use that as a time for prayer. That you can, just enjoy some time, drinking a cup of coffee or talking with your spouse or whatever it is. But whatever it is, it needs to be rest. You need to rest. And whether that's reading, and that doesn't mean literally sitting there staring at a wall, whether it's watching TV or reading a book or sitting on your back deck or drinking a cup of coffee, but whatever it might be, and we're not going to get legalistic with it, just take 5 minutes every day this week to rest. Though Jesus tried to give his disciples the opportunity to rest, the crowds kept coming, and we need to see how Jesus responded to this passage. So to do that, we're going to look at verses 33 through 34. As we do so, I want you to notice what words or images Mark uses to describe Jesus' response to the crowd. So let's think about that as we read verses 33 and 34. It says this, picking up in verse 33, he says, "But many saw them leaving and recognized, and they ran out from all of the towns and arrived ahead of them. When he went ashore, he saw a large crowd and had compassion on them, because they were like sheep without a shepherd. Then he began to teach them many things." So as we look at the passage, we get this imagery here, and Mark uses a particular set of words that we've heard before at Tunnel Hill. We actually talked about this not that long ago, really even this month, or really I guess it was last month, when we were talking about kind of the heart of who we are as a church and what that means. And this idea of he saw them as sheep without a shepherd. Now, it's important to kind of take note here that this would have been a very common imagery at this time. And really, I think even in our time today, we drastically underestimate how dependent sheep are on their shepherds. Sheep are not able to take care of themselves. The way that the sheep have been kind of domesticated and in farm life, even all the way back in Jesus' time, sheep were very dependent on the shepherd. They needed them for protection. They needed them to tell them where they could eat and where they could get safe water. It would not be uncommon for sheep to fall prey to predators. It would not be uncommon for sheep to drown, to get stuck in different places and get hurt and starve. Sheep were not able to care for themselves in virtually any way, shape, or form, and they required the watchful care of a shepherd to lead them where they needed to go, to keep them safe, and to to do what they needed to do, which meant that a sheep without a shepherd, or a flock of sheep with no shepherd, was just by its very nature in tremendous danger. It was in danger from predators. It was in danger from the world around it. It was in danger because of food and water, and in almost every way, shape, and form, they were in danger, and they would often be scared and disorganized, and it was a bad situation to have a flock of sheep or to have sheep without a shepherd. The book goes on to ask this question. It says, what does this say about Jesus and his feelings towards the crowd? And I want you to think about that for a second. Jesus looked at the crowds and said they were like sheep without a shepherd, and we see how he responds in the passage. What do you think that really communicates about how Jesus saw them, or what he felt towards them, and maybe by extension what he feels towards us as people even living today? So why don't we pause the video, take a couple minutes and think about that, and then we'll keep going in our study. All right, so what did Jesus think about this? And I think the important thing to notice here, and we see this in the passage we studied last month, and I think we see it here, and that is that Jesus felt compassion for them. He wasn't indignant towards them. He wasn't annoyed by them. When you think about it, he's trying to get his people away. He's trying to get them an opportunity to rest, and they're not allowing that. And it would be very tempting for us to look at somebody with disdain, to look at someone in a condescending manner, or view them as an annoyance when they were interrupting us in this way. But that's not what Jesus does. Jesus sees these people and recognizes that they have a profound need and has compassion towards them. His heart goes out to them because of how they feel and because of what's going on. And so when we think about that and that compassion, it leads us to kind of understand that Jesus' response is born out of that compassion. Now, when we've seen Jesus say in other times and in different places how he addressed these people with sheep without a shepherd, sometimes it was prayer, sometimes it was teaching his disciples, all that stuff. But I want you to take special notice here that in his compassion, he turns to teaching. In fact, the book says this. It says, other gospel writers mention healing, but Mark focused on Jesus' teaching. The fact that people had gone to great lengths to get to Jesus and stayed to listen reveals how his teaching was just as compelling as his ability to heal. And I think on top of that, when he saw what these people were going through, he wanted them to see the spiritual reality going on around them, and so he took the time to teach them. And I think his teaching was more than just saying that do these things and you'll be better, but he was trying to help them see that they were sheep without a shepherd, and that he was the good shepherd, that he was the one they'd been waiting for. He was the Messiah who would lead them into a right relationship with God. The book asks this question. It says, what draws a person to the teaching of Jesus? And we think about that at any point in time, and I think a lot of things we could say that Jesus is true, that Jesus is not just telling us what we want to hear, that Jesus' teachings are often very profound. I think one of the most amazing things about Jesus' teaching is often how applicable it is in the moment that we read it. Like the timing of Jesus' teaching for me is sometimes just so amazing, where when I'm going through something and I open up my Bible and I begin to read my scripture, whether it's my planned out reading for the day or something that kind of is kind of given to me because of a lesson I'm doing or a video I've watched or whatever it is, how the timing of Jesus' teaching so often just speaks to exactly what is going on in my life. And I just kind of get that reminder of, hey, you're going through something right now. God had something to say about that. And I think that is an amazing thing. While preaching about the kingdom was Jesus' primary mission, he understood that hurting and hungry people might not be as receptive to the gospel. So along with focusing on the spiritual needs of the crowd, Jesus refused to ignore their physical needs. And let's look at that right now. We're going to be looking at Mark chapter 6, verses 35 through 38. And we're going to see kind of the neat thing that is happening here. And I want you to, as I read the passage, I want you to point out what it was, the problem, and with that, what was the solution that the disciples came up with? Let's look at that together. Verses 35 through 38, it says this. When it grew late, his disciples approached him and said, "This place is deserted, and it is already late. Send them away so that they can go into the surrounding countryside and villages and buy themselves something to eat." "You give them something to eat," he responded. And they said to him, "Should we go and buy 200 denarii worth of bread and give them something to eat?" And he, being Jesus, asked them, "How many loaves do you have? Go and see." They found out that they had 5, and they said, 5 and 2 fish. So, let's think about this. So what was the problem? The problem was it was getting to be nighttime. It was getting to be dark. And the people that were there, they had run out of food. If they'd brought a lunch or a picnic or something like that, it was used. They mentioned already in the passage that people kind of saw where they were going and ran towards them. And that might imply that they didn't really plan this. And so a lot of them may have been there the entire day outside, open air, and had not had anything to eat, and now it was getting dark. Places were going to start closing up shop. Merchants were no longer going to have staff on top of that. Most people had already gone to market and bought the things they needed for the day, so who knows if there was anything left. But regardless, if they kept the people any longer, there wasn't going to be anything for them to eat, and they'd have to make the long trek home hungry and as we've been saying, dissatisfied. A little bit about the geography is probably likely that Jesus and his disciples headed to the north part of the Sea of Galilee, where there were some more open areas, some more unpopulated areas. One of the other Gospels, I believe it's the Gospel of Luke, points out that this would have been in the area of Bethsaida. My guess is it wasn't exactly in Bethsaida, but when the people said dismiss them to the villages, Bethsaida would have been one of those nearby villages that they were intending them to go to. And so this is where they're at. And the problem is they have people who are getting hungry, who are probably getting disgruntled because of it, that Jesus needs to kind of wrap things up and release them so that they can go eat before they wear out their welcome. You know, it's the old saying that there's a very fine line between a long sermon and a hostage situation, and that's where they're getting to. And so what's the disciples' solution? Well, the disciples' solution is let the people go. Let them leave. Let them go to the villages and let them go buy their own food. Let them to go take care of themselves, and then we'll take care of ourselves. And that was kind of their solution. Really, it was a good solution. It was a very pragmatic, good solution. Not only would that allow the disciples and Jesus to have some time alone, but also it would give everybody an opportunity to eat, and probably in the long run would make for a more favorable next day or whatever it might be. When we think about this, what kind of resources do we have in our life when we have a problem? Think about this for a second. Think about maybe a problem or a challenge that you've had to face either in your just home or in your job. What were the resources you needed to solve that problem, and what were the people or what was the plan that you had to solve that problem? Take a couple minutes, pause the video, and discuss that. Write that down. When you think of problems you've had in your life, or whether it's career or personal, what resources did you need? What people did you need? What was the plan to solve that problem? Take a couple minutes, discuss that, and then we'll look at what Jesus did. All right, so when we think about this type of stuff, the first thing that popped in my head is so often in our life, we have 3 kids. All of them have extracurricular activities that require them to be certain places at certain times. And every once in a while, my wife will just sit me down and say, okay, we need a plan. How are we going to get every kid to where they need to be on time, and then eventually us all home and in bed that night? And so when we think about that, it's like, okay, so where am I going to be? So I'm a resource. My wife is a resource. Sometimes we have close personal friends that are resources. Our car is a resource. The flexibility of my job, the flexibility of her job, all of those things come into it, and we start to come up with a plan. And it'll be like, okay, if I go pick up this kid and then swing by and get this kid, then I can go drop off this kid here and then this kid here, and then I can stay with that kid until they're done, and then I'll pick up that kid, and then I'll go back and I'll get this kid, and I'll meet you at home. If you'll go get this kid and take that kid over here, and then we'll all meet at home and we'll have dinner and we'll call it a night. And we'll work out that plan, and we know our resources, we know our people, we know our goals, and we work out a plan. And once we have the plan, Liz usually needs to remind me about the plan of at least 2 more times for me to actually successfully do it. But we have a plan, we work that plan, that's what happens. So, they have a plan. Send the people home to the surrounding villages, Let them buy bread, let them buy what they need, and we'll get a break, they'll get a break. This is a great plan. But how does Jesus respond? Let's look back at the text. Verse 37 says this, you give them something to eat. That's Jesus' plan. Well, Jesus' plan was not their plan. And how often in our lives do we think that we have a really good plan and we go to Jesus and we hand him our plan and we say, hey, this is our plan. We've got a great plan. And Jesus says, no, that's not the plan. And in this case, and it's not always the case with God, but in this case, he goes, no, the plan's going to be way simpler than that. Instead of you sending them away and letting them take care of themselves, you're going to take care of them. And you got to love the disciples, because the disciples say, that is not a good plan. In fact, they say, should we go and buy 200 denarii worth of bread and give them something to eat? That statement really implies, and if we look at the other gospel accounts as well, implies that even 200 denarii would not get this job done. Like even that would not be enough. And let me tell you, 200 denarii would be a huge amount in our modern times. A denarii represented usually about a full day's work. And so 200 denarii would literally represent almost 2/3 of an annual salary. So if you think about how much you make or how much the average person makes in the United States today and figure out what about 2/3 of that is, that's how much he's talking. Literally tens of thousands of dollars in kind of a modern understanding of things. And he's saying, would you want us to go take tens of thousands of dollars to buy food for these people? And then they're saying, and even that wouldn't actually feed everybody. It might give them food, but it wouldn't actually feed them. And so, because of that, we have to think about what Jesus is saying. Jesus told his disciples to do this. He told them to give him something to eat. Jesus is wanting to show, the book says it this way, it says, Jesus is wanting to show his disciples what he has already done, and Jesus is wanting to explain to his disciples, I think this is a lesson more for his disciples than even for the people here, that he is the ultimate provider. That he is the one that ultimately is going to be the one that takes care of them. And that classic line that Jesus said when he was being tempted by Satan in the wilderness, and no coincidence that we're in the wilderness now, when he says, man cannot live by bread alone, but by the word of God. And he is showing them, listen, you are concerned about physical things, you are concerned about the things of this world, I will provide, I will take care of you. The disciples were focused on the problem while Jesus was focused on the solution. And think about that for just a moment. Jesus says, give them something to eat. The disciples say, we couldn't do it even with 200 denarii. We couldn't even find the bread. Probably saying, we probably couldn't even go into a town and find 200 denarii worth of bread. There's no way we can feed these people. And Jesus says, have them sit down. Do this stuff. Find out what you do have. I actually talk about this pretty regularly, and I love this about Jesus because they say, if we had 200 denarii worth of bread, we couldn't feed all these people. And he goes, but what do you have? Don't worry about what you don't have. I tell people that all the time when they talk about ministry or when they're talking, even with my kids, as they're talking about doing things, I say, don't focus on what you don't have. It doesn't do any good. Focus on what you do have. What do you have? What do we have in order to feed these people? And the answer was 5 barley loaves and 2 fish. This would have been about enough food to feed one person. And not like fully satisfy one person, feed one person. They point out, I think it's in the Gospel of Luke, that this was something that a boy provided. This honestly would have been a meal for a boy. 5 loaves, 2 dried fish would have been enough food to get a boy through the day. So not enough to feed 5,000, let alone really feed one man so that he's fully satisfied, but enough for a boy. And yet they focus on what they do have, and then they let God do the rest. The book asks a couple questions. Why are we prone to focus on problems instead of considering what God can do? And what practical things can we do to trust Jesus more when we have a problem that seems impossible to solve? Why don't we take a couple minutes to pause the video and discuss that, and then we'll see what Jesus did with all of this. So again, why are we prone to focus on our problems instead of what God can do, and how can we get better? What can we do to trust Jesus more when we have those problems? Take a couple minutes, pause the video, discuss that, and then we'll jump into the last part of our study. Well, I hope you've had some good reflection on that and some good time to do that. I know for me personally, it's easy to get wrapped up in problems and not trust in God. And a lot of times, the most practical thing I can do is make sure I'm praying. Make sure that I am starting my day with prayer. Make sure that I'm taking time to pray when I'm driving in the car, when things seem impossible. Make sure that I'm taking those things to the Lord, because when I find that when I begin to put those things back in God's hands and actually have a conversation with Him, that I find a lot of comfort in the ability to trust Him in the midst of all that. Let's wrap up our study by looking at verses 39 through 44. And I want you to think about how Jesus satisfies the crowds. Picking up in 39, we read this. It says, they found out that they had and it said they have 5 and 2 fish. This is 5 loaves. And then he instructed them to have all the people sit down in groups in the green grass. So he sat down in groups of hundreds and fifties, and he took the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, and looking up to heaven, he blessed and broke the loaves. And he kept giving them to his disciples to set before the people. He also divided the 2 fish among them all, and everyone ate and was satisfied. They picked up the 12 baskets full of pieces of bread and fish. Now those who had eaten the loaves were 5,000 men. So when we look at this passage, we ask the question, how did Jesus satisfy the people? And really, I think it has a lot more to do than just meeting their physical needs. He was showing them that God is the provider. The book says it this way. It says, God had used the disciples to meet many needs during the mission assignment. But even when we know God is at work, we still face challenges that seem beyond us. Those should remind us that we can do nothing in our own strength and that we need Jesus all the time. I really like that statement, that the disciples had this great moment where they'd gone out and they'd done ministry and they had all these wonderful results, but the reality was they still needed to fully rely on God. I was reminded of with that line, what Jesus says in John 15 when he says, I am the vine and you are the branches, and in the midst of that he says, apart from me you can do nothing. And I think that's a very big temptation in the church today. I think it's a very big temptation for us as individuals to think and to believe that we can do things apart from fully depending and trusting in Jesus in all things. And so I would challenge you today, where are the areas of your life that you really aren't trusting God, that you feel like you have these areas of your life under control and you're not trusting God in those areas? Where are those places? And maybe how can you hand those over to Jesus today so that you are trusting on Him more? The book goes on to say this. In fact, it wants me to read verse 43 again. So let me read that again. It says, now those who had eaten the loaves were 5,000 men. Jesus not only fed the crowd, but he also met the disciples' need. In fact, look again at verse 42. It says that they were satisfied. Verse 43 actually says they picked up 12 baskets full of pieces of fish and bread. This is kind of the neat thing that I didn't actually notice about the passage the times I've read it before, is he had 12 disciples. And when all was said and done, and when everybody was fed, there were still 12 baskets, 12 disciples, 12 baskets of fish and bread, which meant that even though at the beginning of our passage it says the disciples had not even been able to eat, now we see how God not only fed the masses, but he took special care of his disciples and his people at that time. One of those things that we need to do is we need to go to God in prayer and ask him to meet our needs. Not try to meet him on our own, not try to do the family planning, not try to do the meal plans, not try to do all those things, but actually take time to lift up our needs to God and ask for him to provide. Now, does that mean we don't work? Absolutely not. God's called us to work. Does that mean we don't financial plan and do the things we need to? Absolutely not. We're supposed to. But ultimately, we need to lift up our needs and the things that we need in life to God and ask for him to provide. This leads us to a last couple of questions, which is this: how do we find genuine satisfaction with all the things that Jesus provides? And how do you think the disciples felt witnessing these miracles? What would that do to your faith? So let me ask you this as we wrap up. What do you think the disciples thought when they saw this? They had to be amazed. They had to be absolutely amazed and bewildered. And I'm sure they were laughing, and because they just kept taking the food to people, coming back to Jesus. There was more food, taking it, coming back, taking it, that they had to know that God was doing a work. and think about what that meant for their faith, but then what would that mean for your faith? And how does something like this and a story like this affect our faith and lead us to that genuine satisfaction for what Jesus can provide? And I want you to close out your time today answering that question. How does a story like this shape our faith and help us to be satisfied in Jesus? And then also I want you to close your time in prayer, just handing things over to God, trusting Him as your provider and the one who is going to meet your needs. Thank you so much for joining us today. We're so glad that you are with us. God bless.